If this message has found you, it's not by accident. Something in you paused. Something in you recognized that quiet pull, that subtle feeling that maybe, just maybe, there's more to this life than what you've been told. Because deep down, you felt it, haven't you? The repetition, the patterns, the strange sense that you're moving through a script that was written long before you ever questioned it. And now here you are, not scrolling past, not dismissing it, but listening. That's the first sign. Not everyone gets here. Not everyone is willing to see beyond the surface. But you're starting to notice the cracks. You're beginning to question the rules, the limits, the invisible boundaries that once felt so real. And that's why this moment matters. Because the instant you become aware, the instant you stop blindly playing along, you step outside of it, even if just for a second. And that second, it changes everything. It doesn't start with a loud moment. There's no dramatic sound, no flashing sign telling you something has changed. It begins quietly, almost too quietly to notice at first. A feeling you can't quite explain, a question that lingers a little longer than usual. You're going through your normal day, doing the same things, talking to the same people, but something feels off. Not wrong, just incomplete, like you're watching your life happen instead of actually living it. And the strange part is, you can't unfeel it once it starts. Maybe it hits you in the middle of the night when everything is still. Or maybe it shows up in the middle of a crowded room where you suddenly feel disconnected, like you don't belong to the noise around you. You start noticing patterns, how people repeat the same conversations, chase the same goals, react in the same predictable ways. And for the first time, you're not fully inside it. You're observing it. That's the shift, subtle but powerful, because awareness doesn't announce itself, it reveals itself. At first you might try to ignore it. You tell yourself you're overthinking, that everyone feels this way sometimes. You distract yourself with routines, with scrolling, with staying busy just to keep that feeling from growing. But it doesn't go away. It waits, patiently. Because once your mind begins to question, it can't go back to sleep the same way again. That curiosity, that discomfort, it's not a problem, it's a signal. And here's the truth, most people won't tell you. The moment you start questioning your reality is the moment you begin stepping outside of it, not physically, but mentally. You're no longer fully controlled by the patterns you once followed without thinking. You start to see how your beliefs were shaped, how your reactions were learned, how your identity was built piece by things you never chose consciously. And that realization can feel unsettling, because if so much of what you are was programmed, then who are you really? That question can feel heavy. It can even feel a little scary, because it means the ground you are standing on isn't as solid as you thought. But at the same time, there's something strangely freeing about it, because if your identity was constructed, it can also be reconstructed. If your limits were learned, they can be unlearned, and suddenly what once felt fixed begins to feel flexible. This awakening moment isn't about having all the answers. It's about realizing that the answers you were given might not be the only ones. It's about stepping into a space where you allow yourself to think differently, to see differently, to question without fear of being wrong. And yes, it can feel lonely at times, because not everyone around you will understand this shift. Some people are comfortable staying inside the patterns. They don't feel the need to question them. And that's okay. Everyone wakes up at their own time, if they choose to. But you didn't land here by accident. Something in you was ready, ready to look deeper, ready to feel uncomfortable if it meant discovering something real. And that readiness is rare, because it takes courage to question the very structure of the life you've been living. It takes honesty to admit that maybe you've been operating on autopilot. And it takes awareness to even notice it in the first place. As this awareness grows, you'll start to catch yourself in moments you used to miss. You'll notice your reactions before they fully take over. You'll question thoughts that once felt automatic. You'll begin to see choices where you once saw only habits. And that's where the shift becomes real, not in some big external change, but in the quiet way you start showing up differently. You're not breaking out of something physical, you're breaking out of unconsciousness. You're stepping out of the loop of repetition and into a space of choice. And that space, it changes everything. Because once you see the pattern, you're no longer trapped inside it the same way. You have distance, you have clarity, and most importantly, you have the ability to decide. So if you've been feeling that quiet shift, that subtle sense that something is changing inside you, don't rush to silence it. Don't try to force it away just because it feels unfamiliar. Lean into it. Pay attention to it. Because this isn't confusion, it's awareness waking up. And the moment you truly see that, you realize you were never as stuck as you thought. It usually happens in a moment so ordinary you almost miss it. You're doing something routine, scrolling, talking, walking through a day that looks exactly like the one before, and then a thought cuts through the noise. Why does this all feel so familiar? Not comforting familiar, but repetitive, scripted, and once that question lands, something shifts. The illusion doesn't shatter all at once. It starts to thin out, like fog lifting just enough for you to realize you've been walking through it your whole life. You begin to notice how predictable everything is. The same reactions, the same expectations, the same invisible rules guiding how people think, speak, and behave. It's like everyone is following a script they never consciously agreed to. And the strange part is, you were following it too, until now. Until this moment where you stepped back, even slightly, and saw it for what it is. That's the beginning of breaking the illusion, not destroying it, but seeing through it. At first it can feel unsettling, because the illusion was comfortable. It gave you structure, certainty, a sense of knowing how things work. When that starts to dissolve, it's like the ground shifts under your feet. You realize that many of the things you believed were just the way life is were actually patterns you absorbed without questioning. Ideas about success, identity, limitations, they weren't necessarily yours. They were handed to you, repeated to you, reinforced until they felt like truth. And now you're seeing the cracks. You notice how people chase things they don't even truly want, just because they've been told they should. You notice how fear keeps people inside invisible boundaries, how doubt is repeated so often it feels like reality. You start to see how powerful belief really is, not because it's always true, but because it shapes perception, and perception shapes everything. But here's where it gets real. Once you see the illusion, you can't fully go back to believing in it the same way. You can still participate in the world, still move through it, still play your part, but there's a layer of awareness now, a quiet knowing that there's more beneath the surface, and that awareness gives you something most people don't realize they're missing: choice. Before, your reactions were automatic. You felt something, you responded. You thought something, you believed it. But now, there's a pause, a small gap between what happens and how you respond to it. And inside that gap is freedom, because you can question it. You can choose differently. You can decide whether that thought, that belief, that pattern actually belongs to you, or if it's just something you've been running on repeat. Breaking the illusion doesn't mean rejecting everything around you. It means seeing it clearly. It means understanding that what you experience isn't fixed. It's filtered. Filtered through your beliefs, your focus, your expectations. And once you realize that, you begin to understand something powerful. If the filter can shape your reality, it can also reshape it. That's where many people hesitate, because seeing the illusion is one thing. Taking responsibility for what comes next is another. It's easier to stay in familiar patterns, even when you know they're limiting, than to step into the unknown. Because the unknown requires awareness, intention, and sometimes letting go of who you thought you were. But if you've made it this far, if you're noticing these patterns, questioning these ideas, then you've already started. You've already stepped beyond blind acceptance, and that matters more than you realize. Because awareness isn't passive. It changes how you move, how you think, how you see yourself and the world around you. You'll start to catch the illusion in real time. You'll notice when fear tries to convince you something is impossible. You'll see when old beliefs try to pull you back into familiar limits. And instead of automatically accepting them, you'll pause, you'll question, you'll decide. And that decision, no matter how small, is a step outside the illusion. This isn't about becoming disconnected from reality, it's about becoming conscious within it. It's about recognizing that you're not just a passive character in a fixed story. You're aware, you're observing, and because of that, you have influence over how the story unfolds. So when you feel that shift, that moment where things don't look quite the same anymore, don't ignore it. That's clarity breaking through. That's the illusion losing its grip little by little. And the more you see it, the less control it has over you. Not because the world changes instantly, but because you do. It starts with a question you didn't plan to ask. Not something dramatic, not something you rehearsed, just a quiet interruption in your thinking. What if this isn't the only way to see things? And that single question has a strange kind of power, because once it enters your mind, it doesn't leave easily. It lingers, it expands, it begins to touch everything you once accepted without hesitation. You go back to your usual routines, but now there's a subtle distance between you and your thoughts. You catch yourself reacting the same way you always have, but this time you notice it. You notice the tone in your voice, the assumptions behind your words, the automatic conclusions your mind jumps to. And instead of fully identifying with them, you start observing them. That's the shift. You're no longer just thinking, you're aware that you're thinking. And that awareness changes everything, because once you begin questioning reality, you also begin questioning yourself. Not in a harsh or critical way, but in a curious, almost investigative way. You start asking, why do I believe this? Where did this idea come from? Is this actually true, or have I just repeated it so many times that it feels true? And those questions start peeling back layers you didn't even know were there. You realize how much of your identity was built from repetition. Things you were told as a child, expectations you absorbed from your environment, opinions you adopted because they were easier than forming your own. It's not that any of it was intentionally forced on you. It's just how things happen. You learn by observing, by mimicking, by adapting. But at some point, those borrowed ideas become so familiar that they feel like they're yours. And now you're seeing that they might not be. That realization can feel strange at first. Almost like you're standing in a room you've lived in your whole life, but suddenly noticing details you've never paid attention to before. The walls haven't changed, but your awareness of them has. And because of that, they don't feel quite as permanent anymore. You start to question the rules you've been living by, the invisible boundaries that once felt absolute. Ideas like what's possible for you, what you're capable of, what you deserve. You begin to see how those limits weren't necessarily facts. They were interpretations, conclusions formed at a certain point in time, based on a certain level of awareness. And here's where it gets interesting. If those limits were formed once, they can be reformed again. But questioning reality isn't always comfortable. It can create a kind of internal tension, where part of you wants to explore these new perspectives, and another part wants to hold on to what's familiar. Because familiarity feels safe, even if it's limiting. The unknown, on the other hand, feels uncertain, even if it holds more freedom. You might notice yourself going back and forth. One moment you feel clear, like you're seeing things in a completely new way, and the next moment you're pulled back into old patterns, old thoughts, old reactions. That's normal. It's not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you're in the process of change. Because questioning reality isn't about instantly replacing everything you once believed. It's about creating space between you and those beliefs. Space where you can examine them, understand them, and decide whether they still serve you. And the more you create that space, the more clarity you gain. You begin to notice how your perception shapes your experience. How two people can look at the same situation and see completely different things. How your focus determines what stands out and what fades into the background. And slowly, you start to understand that reality, as you experience it, isn't just something happening to you. It's something being filtered through you. That realization isn't about denying the world around you. It's about recognizing your role in how you experience it. It's about seeing that your thoughts, your beliefs, your assumptions, they're not just passive observations, they're active participants. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You begin to question not just what you think, but how you think, the patterns, the habits, the default settings of your mind. And with that awareness comes a new kind of responsibility, not forced, but natural. Because when you realize you have influence over your perception, you also realize you have a choice in how you engage with it. So instead of automatically accepting every thought, you start to pause. Instead of reacting without awareness, you begin to observe. And in that observation, something powerful happens. You create the possibility of change. Not overnight, not all at once, but gradually, consistently, in small moments that build over time. And that's how questioning reality works. It doesn't tear everything down in an instant. It gently loosens the grip of what once felt fixed. It opens doors where you thought there were walls. And most importantly, it reminds you that what you see isn't the only way things can be. And once you truly understand that, you realize you've already stepped beyond the limits you used to live inside. There's a moment that doesn't look like much from the outside, but inside it changes everything. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's just you catching yourself before you react the way you always have. A thought appears, a familiar one, something you've believed for years, and instead of accepting it instantly, you pause. That pause might only last a second, but in that second, something powerful happens. You realize you don't have to agree with every thought that enters your mind. That's where awareness becomes power. Because for most of your life, your thoughts have been running automatically, one leading to another, shaping your emotions, guiding your actions, all without being questioned. It's like a loop, predictable, repetitive, comfortable in a way that you don't even notice it's there. But the moment you become aware of that loop, the moment you see it happening in real time, you step outside of it, even if just slightly. And that slight distance, it changes how everything feels. You begin to notice how quickly your mind jumps to conclusions, how it fills in gaps with assumptions, how it replays old stories and calls them facts. And before you would have gone along with it without thinking. But now there's a shift. You're watching it happen. You're seeing the pattern instead of being fully inside it. At first, this awareness can feel strange, almost like you're observing yourself from the outside. You might catch yourself thinking something negative or limiting, and instead of fully believing it, you hear it, you recognize it. And that recognition creates space, space between you and the thought, space where you can decide what to do with it. And that's where your power lives. Not in controlling every thought, but in choosing which ones you give your attention to. Because here's something most people don't realize. Not every thought deserves your belief. Just because your mind produces it doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean it's helpful. It doesn't mean it defines you. It's just a thought. And the more aware you become, the more you start to see thoughts as options rather than instructions. That shift alone can change how you experience your entire life. You'll start to notice how certain thoughts lead to certain feelings and how those feelings influence your actions. You'll see how one small belief repeated over time can shape your confidence, your decisions, your direction. And once you see that connection, you begin to understand just how much influence your awareness actually has. Because awareness interrupts autopilot. Instead of reacting instantly, you respond consciously. Instead of following old patterns, you question them. Instead of assuming something is fixed, you consider that it might be flexible. And in those small moments of awareness, you begin to take back control, not in a forceful way, but in a natural, intentional way. It's not about becoming perfect or never having negative thoughts again. That's not realistic. The mind will always produce a range of thoughts. It's what it does. But awareness changes your relationship with those thoughts. It gives you the ability to step back and say, I see this, but I don't have to follow it. And that's a different way of living. You'll find yourself pausing more often, reflecting before reacting, choosing your words more carefully, not because you're trying to control everything, but because you're aware of the impact they have. You'll notice when you're slipping into old habits, and instead of staying there unconsciously, you'll catch it sooner. You'll bring yourself back. And each time you do that, your awareness strengthens. It's like a muscle. The more you use it, the more natural it becomes. What once felt difficult, pausing, observing, choosing, starts to feel normal. And what once felt normal, reacting automatically, believing every thought, starts to feel limiting. You begin to trust yourself in a different way, not because you have all the answers, but because you know you can observe, adjust, and choose. You're not at the mercy of every passing thought or emotion. You have a level of clarity that allows you to navigate them instead of being controlled by them. And that's where real change happens, not in big dramatic moments, but in these quiet shifts of awareness that happen throughout your day. A thought appears, you notice it. An emotion rises, you observe it. A reaction begins, you pause. And in that pause, you choose. That choice might seem small, but it adds up. Over time, it reshapes how you think, how you feel, how you respond to the world around you. It moves you from unconscious patterns into conscious living. So when you start to notice these moments, these small pauses where you're aware of what's happening inside you, don't overlook them. That's not random. That's your awareness growing stronger. That's you stepping into your power, one moment at a time. And the more you lean into that awareness, the more you realize something important. You were never truly powerless. You just hadn't been looking closely enough to see it. There comes a point where you realize it's not just about seeing the pattern anymore. It's about deciding whether you're going to keep playing it. And that realization can hit you in the middle of the most ordinary moment. You're doing something you've done 100 times before, reacting the way you always have, thinking the same familiar thoughts, and suddenly it feels repetitive, predictable, almost like you're watching yourself follow a script you didn't consciously choose. And in that moment, a quiet question rises. Do I have to keep doing this? That's where detachment begins. Not in some dramatic withdrawal from life, not in disconnecting from everything around you, but in loosening your grip on the automatic patterns that once defined you. It's a subtle shift. You're still there, still present, still moving through your day, but something inside you is no longer fully tied to every thought, every reaction, every expectation. You start to notice how quickly your mind labels things, good or bad, success or failure, right or wrong. And before, those labels felt absolute. They shaped how you felt instantly. But now there's a gap, a space where you can see the label forming and choose whether to accept it. And that changes how everything lands. A situation that once would have frustrated you still happens, but you don't get pulled into it the same way. A comment that once would have stayed in your mind for hours passes through more lightly. It's not that you don't feel anything anymore. It's that you're not as attached to every feeling that arises. That's what people often misunderstand about detachment. It's not about becoming cold or indifferent. It's about becoming aware enough to not be controlled by every internal reaction. It's about recognizing that thoughts and emotions are experiences, not identities. And once you see that, something begins to loosen. You realize that you don't have to chase every thought your mind produces. You don't have to defend every belief as if it defines who you are. You don't have to hold on to every story just because it's familiar. You can let things pass. You can observe without absorbing everything. At first, this can feel unusual, almost like you're stepping back from something you used to be fully inside of. You might even question it. Am I becoming distant? Am I disconnecting? But if you look closely, you'll notice that you're actually becoming more present, not less, because you're no longer lost in automatic reactions. You're aware, you're choosing, and that choice creates a different kind of experience. You start to respond instead of react. You start to listen more, not just to others, but to yourself. You begin to notice the difference between what you genuinely feel and what you've been conditioned to feel. And that awareness allows you to move through situations with more clarity, more intention. You'll still have moments where old patterns show up. That doesn't disappear overnight. But the difference is you catch them. You see them as they're happening. And instead of being pulled in completely, you have the option to step back. And sometimes that step back is all it takes to break the cycle. Because patterns rely on repetition. They continue because they're followed without question. But the moment you stop automatically engaging with them, even briefly, you interrupt that repetition. You create a new possibility, a different way of responding, a different way of being. Detaching from the script doesn't mean you stop participating in life. It means you stop participating unconsciously. You're still part of the experience, but you're no longer being carried by it without awareness. And there's a quiet kind of freedom in that. You're not as easily pulled into things that once felt overwhelming. You don't feel the same pressure to react immediately, to prove something, to hold on to every outcome. You begin to trust the process a little more, not because everything is certain, but because you're grounded in your awareness. And that grounding gives you stability, even when things around you are uncertain. You start to see that you don't need to control everything to feel at ease. You don't need to predict every outcome to feel secure, because your sense of stability isn't coming from external situations. It's coming from your ability to observe, to adapt, to choose. And that's a different kind of strength. So when you notice yourself stepping back, when you feel that slight distance between you and your automatic reactions, don't resist it. That's not disconnection, that's clarity. That's you beginning to move beyond the script, beyond the patterns that once ran without question. And the more you allow that space, the more you realize something important. You're still here, still present, still engaged, just not trapped in the same way anymore. And that's where real freedom begins.